Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in Charleston's history. Before we start, please leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know where these documented accounts go and what times of day or night they reach. Charleston's summer of 1843 was especially hot and humid. Those who could afford it had already gone back to their country homes to escape the heat and the yellow fever epidemic that was killing people at an alarming rate. But at number 17 Lagar Street, the Beaumont house was still occupied. Its windows were tightly shut, even though the air was thick with humidity that felt like a burial shroud. Charleston County tax records show that Gerald Beaumont bought the property in 1828. He was a merchant who made a lot of money trading textiles between Charleston and Liverpool. The records show that when he died in 1841, the property went to his only daughter, Eveline, who was 26 and not married at the time. This was unusual for a woman of her age and status in Charleston society. The Charleston Mercury Society pages from 1838 to 1842 mention Miss Beaumont going to different events from time to time, but many accounts say she was shy and picky about who she hung out with. According to courthouse records, the events that would later cast a shadow over Lagar Street began on the 27th of June, 1843, when Eveline Beaumont bought a new slave named Marcus Reed. We know for sure that by 1843, Eveline Beaumont lived alone in the house, except for 7 enslaved people who worked there. Grimald & Sons, one of the city's biggest slave trading companies, handled the deal. The price paid for this purchase is what makes it unusual, not the act itself. County records show that Beaumont paid Reed $480, which was almost twice as much as the average price for a field worker at that time. Even more strange was the fact that Reed wasn't a field worker at all. Records from Grimald & Sons say he was literate, 29 years old, suitable for domestic service, and had previously worked as a manservant for Colonel James Weatherby of Savannah, Georgia. One of the first questions that comes to mind in this troubling story is why Miss Beaumont would pay so much for a domestic servant when she already had a full staff. In Charleston in 1843, there were strict but unwritten rules about how white women of standing could interact with enslaved men. Enslaved men were rarely allowed to work as valets or personal assistants for white women. However, records from St. Michael's Church show that Reverend Thomas Palmer saw Reed acting as Miss Beaumont's personal attendant during his regular visits to the Beaumont residence that summer. He thought this was strange but not unheard of, because the lady was known for being strange. The Charleston Medical Society archives have Dr. William Harrington's medical log, which shows that he was called to the Beaumont home on August 15 of that year. The reason for the visit was written down as female complaint, which was a common euphemism used by doctors at the time when treating women for a variety of conditions that were not appropriate to name directly. This visit was the first of 23 that Dr. Harrington would make to the house over the next 7 months, which is why it is important. Sarah Jenkins, an enslaved cook in the Beaumont household, later said that Miss Beaumont stopped going to social events altogether by the end of August. Jenkins's account, recorded during the subsequent investigation, states, Miss Eveline ceased to receive callers entirely, save for the doctor and the reverend. She gave instructions that the drapes were to remain drawn at all hours, and that no one was to enter the east wing of the house except for herself and the new man, Marcus. The Charleston Mercury Society pages from September through December of 1843 contain no mention of Eveline Beaumont at any social function. An absence that would have been noted in a community where social obligations were treated with the utmost seriousness, particularly for a woman of her standing. A letter from Mrs. Eleanor Pinckney to her daughter in Philadelphia on October 12 mentions this absence briefly. The Beaumont girl has become positively reclusive these past months. There is talk that she has developed some nervous condition, though Dr. Harrington remains discreet on the matter. Some speculate that her father's passing has finally affected her mind, delayed though such a reaction might seem. The strange stillness that had settled over the Beaumont house didn't change during the winter in Charleston. Dr. Harrington was the only regular visitor. By January 1844, he was coming twice a week. Reverend Palmer's parish records show that he visited the Beaumonts every Sunday after church to bring Miss Beaumont communion, who remains indisposed. Many people in the area wondered what went on inside 17 Lagar Street during those months. Rachel Cooper, a slave who worked as a house servant on the property next door, would later say that she often heard crying late at night, though I can't say for sure if it was Miss Beaumont or another woman. Peter Brown, a free black man who patrolled Lagar Street at night, had more troubling things to say. In 1845, he told the authorities that he had seen a tall man moving between the main house and the carriage house in the middle of the night 3 times between November 1843 and February 1844. The man was carrying what looked like a heavy bundle. Brown said that he had assumed it was household business of no concern to me and had not told anyone about the sightings at the time. The most important thing that Dr. Harrington wrote down in his medical log was on the 3rd of March 1844. The notes are usually short, but this one is very detailed. Attended Miss Beaumont for the final phase of her female complaint. Mother and child appear in good health, considering the circumstances. Have administered the usual tonic and recommended complete rest. The situation remains confidential, as per agreement. This is the first time that Eveline Beaumont's pregnancy and birth have been documented. In the South, before the Civil War, an unmarried woman of Eveline's social class would have been ruined by such an event, not just in terms of her reputation, but also in terms of her place in society. In a community that cared a lot about bloodlines and racial purity, it would have been very important to know who the father was. Eveline Beaumont did not have a birth certificate or baptismal record for any of her children. But the parish registry of St. Michael's Church has an entry from the 10th of March 1844 that says, infant male child Thomas, born to household servant Patience. Patience was one of the enslaved women owned by the Beaumont household, and property records say she was aged 24 years, domestic worker. Here, the historical record presents the initial of multiple profoundly unsettling contradictions. Sarah Jenkins' testimony from 1845 says clearly, Patience had not been with child. There was no way she could have had a baby. Miss Eveline told us that Patience would be caring for her sister's child, who had been sent from the country after the sister died of fever. But we all knew Patience had no sister. Eleanor Pinckney wrote to her daughter in April 1844 that Eveline Beaumont had come out of her mysterious seclusion and was starting to show up in Charleston society again. Mrs. Pinckney said that Miss Beaumont looked altered somehow, thinner certainly, but with a strange intensity about her that some find discomforting. The Charleston Mercury of May 7, 1844, says that Miss Beaumont went to a benefit concert for the orphans of the yellow fever epidemic. The short social note also says that Miss Beaumont has generously pledged $100 to the care of children left parentless by the recent epidemic. This is a large amount of money that shows her Christian charity. Between March and September of 1844, not much is known about what happened behind the closed doors of the Beaumont home. The accounts of household servants only give us bits and pieces of the truth. Rachel Davis, a laundress who was enslaved in the house, later said, "There was a baby in the house, kept in the East Wing, but we were not allowed to talk about it or go there. Miss Eveline and Marcus were the only ones who could take care of it." According to household accounting books found during the investigation that followed, Eveline Beaumont made a number of strange purchases during this time, including imported English baby clothes from Fraser and Company, a silver christening cup from Hayden Brothers Silversmiths, and maybe most importantly, a custom-made miniature portrait locket from Mono Jewelers. The receipt for this last item, which is dated June 18th, says 2 portrait settings with inscription, as directed. Eveline Beaumont went to the offices of Preston and Whitfield, one of Charleston's most well-known law firms, on the 23rd of September 1844 without warning. The company's appointment book says that she met with senior partner George Preston for more than 3 hours. It would be a long time before anyone knew what happened at this meeting. 2 days after this meeting, the Charleston Courier's classified section had an ad that would later turn out to be important. For sale, healthy female domestic servant, age 24 years, with male infant child age 6 months, excellent house servant, trained in fine cooking and needlework, selling due to household reduction, inquiries to be directed to Preston and Whitfield, attorneys. Patience was the female domestic servant, and the male baby was the child who had been baptized as Thomas 6 months before. This ad is especially important because it is the first known example of what was called a fancy sale at the time, the sale of a slave woman and her child, aimed at buyers with certain interests. James Woodward, a wealthy planter from Colleton County, bought Patience and the baby on October 2nd for $900, which is an extremely high price. Several historians have said that this shows Woodward knew he was buying something more than just domestic help. Eveline Beaumont could not have known that her carefully planned story would start to fall apart just a few weeks after the sale was finished. Marcus Reed, who had been living with the Beaumont family during all of this, was the one who set things in motion. According to records kept by the county sheriff, Marcus Reed was caught trying to get on a ship headed north to Philadelphia on the 21st of October, 1844. He had $215, which was a lot of money for a slave, and a letter to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. At the time, the contents of this letter were kept secret, but they would later be very important for understanding what happened at the Beaumont residence. Reed was quickly sent to the Charleston workhouse on charges of trying to escape and stealing. The jailer's log says that Eveline Beaumont came to see him on October 23rd and had what was called a heated exchange. After this visit, Reed was put in solitary confinement, supposedly for insolent and threatening behavior toward his mistress. What happened next looks like a planned effort to permanently silence Reed. On October 25th, Eveline Beaumont filed formal charges against Reed in court. She said he stole valuable items from her home and tried to attack her. In antebellum South Carolina, these kinds of accusations, especially the last one, were basically a death sentence for a slave. But then the case took an unexpected turn when George Preston, the lawyer who had handled the sale of Patience and the baby, came forward with a shocking news. Court records show that Preston said Eveline Beaumont had asked him about the legal consequences of a child being born to a white woman, but claiming to be born to an enslaved woman in order to hide it and then get rid of it. Preston also said that he had told Miss Beaumont that doing this would be fraud in the sale of property and maybe even worse crimes, depending on how the child was conceived. He said that he had turned down the offer to be part of the scheme, but that Beaumont had gone ahead without his help, using his company's name in the newspaper ad. This testimony changed what seemed like a simple case of a slave trying to escape into something much more complicated and scandalous right away. Judge William Harper, who was in charge of the case, told the police to look into the claims about the child's parentage and sale right away. The investigation quickly turned to finding the letter that Marcus Reed had with him when he was arrested. This document, which was entered into evidence on November 3rd, had Reed's story of what happened at the Beaumont house. He said that he had been bought because Eveline Beaumont had developed an unnatural attraction to him, and that she had forced him to be with her by threatening to punish him severely or sell him to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Reed's letter also said that Miss Beaumont was pregnant and had kept it a secret from people in Charleston. After she gave birth, she made Patience say that the child was hers, with the plan to sell both mother and child later to get rid of any proof of her wrongdoing. The most damning thing about Reed's letter was that it said, "The child born of this union bears upon his left shoulder a distinctive mark, identical to one upon my own person, passed down through my maternal line." This claim about the identifying birthmark gave investigators a way to check Reed's claims. Judge Harper ordered James Woodward to bring Patience and the baby in for an examination. At first, Woodward didn't want to do it, but he did when he was threatened with charges of obstruction. Dr. Harrington, the same doctor who had cared for Eveline Beaumont while she was in jail, and two other doctors from the Charleston Medical Society examined the baby on the 12th of November, 1844. They found a unique birthmark on the baby's left shoulder. When Dr. Harrington was shown his own medical records showing how he treated Miss Beaumont, he swore that he had indeed delivered her child and had been paid a large sum to keep quiet about it. The Charleston Mercury called the case a scandal unparalleled in the recent history of our society, because it involved an unmarried white woman of high social standing who had a child with an enslaved man and then tried to sell the child. The case brought up the deepest fears and taboos of antebellum Southern culture: miscegenation, the breaking down of racial hierarchies, and the corruption of white feminine virtue. The court cases that came after were very unusual. Eveline Beaumont was accused of fraud in the sale of the child, perjury in her accusations against Marcus Reed, and what court documents called moral crimes against the natural order. Marcus Reed was still in custody, but he was now being held as a material witness instead of as an accused criminal. The most important legal issue, one that had few if any precedents in American law at the time, was the status of the baby. If Eveline Beaumont, a free white woman, was the child's mother, then the legal principle of partus sequita ventrum, that which is brought forth follows the womb, would mean that the child was free no matter what the father's status was. But this same child had been sold as a slave, which made the law very confusing. Charleston society was split as the case moved toward trial in early 1845. Some well-known families like the Pinckneys and the Rutledges stopped supporting Eveline Beaumont altogether. But others closed ranks around her, saying that Marcus Reed had corrupted and forced her to do things which changed the real power dynamic between enslaved people and their owners. What could have been a landmark case never reached its full conclusion in court. On the 17th of January 1845, Eveline Beaumont was found dead in her bedroom at 17 Lagar Street. The coroner's report said the cause was consumption of laudanum in amounts sufficient to stop breathing, which was a common 19th century way of saying that someone had killed themselves by taking too much. Opium. There was a sealed letter next to her body that was addressed to Reverend Palmer of St. Michael's Church. No one has ever seen what this letter says. Church records only show that Palmer asked for and got permission to seal it in the church archives for 50 years, during which time the people named in it would have died. The criminal case fell apart when Eveline Beaumont died. Gerald Beaumont's estate now owned Marcus Reed as property that was once enslaved. Some people thought that buying Reed was an act of mercy, while others thought it was an attempt to bury the scandal deeper. A group of Charleston merchants bought Reed and sent him to Liberia as part of the American Colonization Society's resettlement program. There is no more information about his life in American archives. The fates of Patience and the baby Thomas were just as complicated. James Woodward may have sold both the mother and the child to a planter in Georgia because he was aware of the legal gray areas surrounding the child's status. This effectively took them out of Charleston's jurisdiction. Some members of the Charleston Anti-Slavery Society tried to find them, but they vanished into the huge and cruel system of American chattel slavery. For almost 10 years after Eveline Beaumont died, no one lived at 17 Lagar Street. Folklorist Eliza Pinckney wrote in 1860 that no family in Charleston would agree to live in a house with such unnatural occurrences. A Boston merchant bought the property in 1854, but since he was new to Charleston, he may not have known about its past. In 1895, while workers were fixing up the east wing of the house, they found a small, sealed compartment behind a false panel in what had been Eveline Beaumont's bedroom. Inside was a silver locket with 2 small portraits, one of Eveline Beaumont and one of a baby boy with striking eyes that, according to the contractor's written account, bore an unsettling resemblance to the portraits of the lady herself. The locket's inscription read, "My heart divided against itself, E.B. and T.B. 1844. The locket and its contents were given to the Charleston Historical Society, where they were on display until 1932, when they were taken down at the request of the Beaumont family's descendants. We don't know where they are now. An unexpected source may have given the most disturbing ending to this story. In 1893, a man named Thomas Wilson wrote a short memoir for a Philadelphia newspaper in which he said he was the son of Marcus Reed and Eveline Beaumont. Wilson, who was in his late 42nd at the time, said that members of the Underground Railroad had taken him north after he had been sold to Georgia. He had been raised by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. Historians have confirmed that Wilson's account included details about the Beaumont residence that could only have been known by someone who lived there or by someone who had heard about it in great detail. He said that Reverend Palmer had given him the letter that Eveline Beaumont wrote the night she died. Wilson said that the letter had a full confession of what Beaumont had done. as well as her clear wish that her son should know that she knew she had done something very wrong by treating her own son as property to be disposed of in her last hours. Historians and archivists still don't agree on whether Wilson's claims are true. There is no clear proof that he was the baby Thomas, or that he wasn't. However, there is no doubt about the official records that show Eveline Beaumont's pregnancy, the birth of a child, the false claim that the child belonged to an enslaved woman, and the later attempt to sell the child into slavery. The case of Eveline Beaumont and Marcus Reed exemplifies the egregious moral contradictions inherent in American slavery, a system that not only sanctioned the commodification of individuals, but also fostered conditions where even the most intimate human relationships could be perverted by the harsh principles of property and ownership. Some people in Charleston still say that 17 Lagar Street is haunted by the sounds of its past. People who work at night and people who walk by have said they have heard a woman crying or seen a woman in 19th century dress standing at an upstairs window, looking out as if she were looking for someone who had been gone for a long time. No matter what people think about these stories, it's clear that a woman once made the horrible choice to sell her own child instead of dealing with the social consequences of crossing the strict lines of race and class that defined her world. In doing so, she showed the worst contradictions of a society built on slavery, contradictions that would eventually tear a country apart. The 50-year seal on Eveline Beaumont's last letter ran out in 1895. At that point, Reverend Palmer had been dead for a long time, and the Civil War had done a lot of damage to St. Michael's Church. Church archives from that time are missing, and historians have searched a lot, but still haven't found the letter. Eveline Beaumont's last testimony, like so many others from that troubled time, has been lost to time, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered. However, when workers were fixing up St. Michael's Church in 1962, they found a hidden compartment under the floorboards of what used to be Reverend Palmer's office. There was a small tin box inside with some papers that had been hidden there before the Civil War. There was a sealed envelope with Eveline Beaumont's unique handwriting on it among these papers. Historians are still not sure if this was the famous last letter or something else, because the church authorities took the papers and put them in a private collection without letting scholars look at them. In a 1968 book, historian Dr. Margaret Thornton said that she had been given a short look at these documents and had seen what looked like a confession written by Eveline Beaumont. Dr. Thornton says that the letter proved that Beaumont and Reed were in a relationship, but it also said that Reed had been using Beaumont from the start to get his own freedom and that of his child. Other scholars have disagreed with Thornton's account, and without the original documents, the truth is still hard to find. The Journal of Dr. William Harrington, which was found among his papers after he died in 1858, is the only thing we know for sure. In entries he never meant for anyone else to see, Harrington wrote in clinical detail about the birth of Eveline Beaumont's child. He noted that the infant bears unmistakable evidence of its mixed parentage, though not so pronounced as to immediately draw notice from casual observers. He also wrote that Miss Beaumont had shown appropriate maternal affection toward the child at first, but had become more and more upset as she realized what was happening. Harrington's entry from February 1844 was the most revealing. He wrote, "Miss B. confided to me today her growing terror that her secret will be discovered. The child's features, initially indistinct, as with all newborns, have begun to resolve themselves into a countenance that bears marked resemblance to the father. She speaks of hearing whispers among the household staff, and imagines accusatory glances from the few visitors she still receives. I have prescribed laudanum to calm her nerves, though I fear she may be developing a dependence on the preparation." This entry shows how Eveline Beaumont's mental health got worse as she tried to keep up the lie. It was clear that the stress of hiding not only the child's existence, but also its parentage had a terrible effect on her mental health. In this context, the choice to give the child to patients and then sell both mother and child seems less like a cold, calculated move and more like a desperate move by a woman who is stuck in the strict rules of her society and her own growing paranoia. Sarah Jenkins, the enslaved cook in the Beaumont household, gave us more information about how people's minds worked at this time. In testimony given after Beaumont's death, Jenkins described how Miss Eveline would sometimes sit for hours in the nursery, holding the child and weeping. Other times, she would refuse to look at it for days, ordering patients to keep it out of her sight and hearing. Her mood swung like a pendulum, from tender to terrified to cruel. Jenkins also recounted a particularly disturbing incident that occurred in August 1844, approximately 5 months after the child's birth. Miss Eveline had the child brought to the dining room during an evening when she had invited Reverend Palmer to dine. She presented the infant as Patience's child and watched the Reverend's face intently as he blessed the child. Later that night, I heard her pacing in her room, repeating over and over, "He knows. God help me." I could see it in his eyes. He knows. This incident suggests that Beaumont's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she was testing the effectiveness of her deception, perhaps unconsciously seeking either reassurance that her secret remained hidden or absolution through discovery. The fact that she chose a man of the cloth as the subject of this test shows how much her actions had become mixed up with moral and spiritual issues. Parts of Reverend Palmer's diary were published by the South Carolina Historical Society in 1922. They make vague references to the Beaumont situation. On the 5th of September 1844, Palmer wrote, "Visited the Beaumont household today. The lady of the house seems more and more upset and talks in circles about divine judgment and the inheritance of sin. I worry about her spiritual health, but I can't ask for more help on her behalf because of the seal of confidence. I can only keep pointing her to Scripture and prayer. Though I wonder if she really wants to be saved, or just wants to feel better about herself." The relationship between Eveline Beaumont and Marcus Reed is still the most complicated and unclear part of this story. The power dynamic between the enslaver and the enslaved fundamentally inhibits the potential for authentic consent or equitable emotional exchange. However, the accounts of household servants indicate that a more complex dynamic than mere coercion transpired between them. Rachel Davis, the laundress, said, "Miss Eveline and Marcus often spoke together in low voices in the library. Sometimes I would hear them laughing, and other times there would be heated words, but they were always too quiet for me to make out clearly. He had ways of moving in that house that no other enslaved person would dare, entering rooms without knocking, speaking without being spoken to first." This unusual level of familiarity and apparent freedom given to Reed suggests that the relationship had grown beyond the usual rules that governed interactions between white women and undersvergessens. Enslaved men in antebellum Charleston. It's impossible to say for sure if this was a real emotional connection, a planned manipulation by Reed to make things better for himself, or some complicated mix of the two. It is evident that Reed exhibited a level of literacy and sophistication atypical for an enslaved individual of that period. The letter he had when he tried to run away was written in what court records called an educated hand, with sophisticated vocabulary and grammatical construction. This suggests that Reed had learned things that were not usually allowed for enslaved people, who were often actively discouraged or legally barred from learning to read and write. One of the most interesting things about this case is still how and why Eveline Beaumont bought Marcus Reed in the first place. Court records show that Reed used to belong to Colonel James Weatherby of Savannah, who hired him as a personal servant. After Beaumont's death, investigators tried to talk to Colonel Weatherby about Reed's character and background, but they found out that Weatherby had died 3 months after selling Reed to the Beaumont family. But Weatherby's widow gave a statement that made things even more unclear. She said that Marcus Reed had been a troublesome influence in our household, and that Colonel Weatherby had sold him after finding out that he was trying to ingratiate himself with female members of the Contretingant family. She also said that Reed had ideas above his station and had once been caught reading books from her husband's library without permission. What makes this testimony so interesting is that it hints that Reed may have made a habit of trying to date white women who had power or influence over him. It is impossible to tell if this was a real romantic or sexual preference or a planned way to make things better for him. It is evident that Reed possessed both the intellect and the social acumen to maneuver through the perilous social landscape of the antebellum South with a level of autonomy atypical for an enslaved individual. There has never been a clear answer to the question of how Eveline Beaumont found out about Reed and decided to buy him, but a letter found in Eleanor Pinckney's papers gives a very interesting hint. Written in May 1843, about a month before Beaumont bought Reed. The letter says that Miss Beaumont was quite taken with the handsome manservant who attended Colonel Weatherby at the Simpson wedding breakfast. She inquired most particularly about his background and training. I thought little of it at the time, assuming she sought to improve the quality of her own household staff. But in light of subsequent events, one wonders if her interest was of a more personal nature from the very beginning. If this account is accurate, it suggests that the initial attraction may have been Beaumont's, and that she deliberately sought out Reed after their first encounter. This turns the usual story of the enslaved man as a predator or seducer of white women's virtue on its head. This story was spread by some of Beaumont's supporters after the scandal broke. The conception and birth of the child, named Thomas, symbolized the transgression of boundaries within the Beaumont household. Dr. Harrington's medical records show that the pregnancy went normally, but he did note that Miss B shows none of the common maternal anticipation one typically observes in women of her station. She speaks of the child as a problem to be managed, rather than a blessing to be welcomed. The birth itself, which took place on March 3, 1844, was attended by Dr. Harrington and a midwife named Ruth, an enslaved woman borrowed from a neighboring household specifically for this purpose. Later testimony says that Ruth was taken back to her owners right after the birth and sold to a Florida plantation within a week. This was another loose end that Beaumont was able to tie up in the story he was telling. It looks like the decision to give the child to Patience was made long before the birth. Sarah Jenkins said that Patience was mostly kept in her room for a few months before the baby was born, and meals were brought to her. When anyone from outside the household called, it was mentioned that Patience was in a delicate condition. Meanwhile, Miss Eveline stayed mostly in her rooms, saying she was suffering from nervous exhaustion that required complete rest. This careful choreography suggests a level of premeditation that makes it hard to see Eveline Beaumont as just a victim of circumstances or her own emotions. The intentional creation of a false story about the child's parentage, which included Patience being effectively imprisoned and social norms being changed, shows that Beaumont was willing to do anything to keep her social status, even if it meant hurting those she held in bondage. The time between the child's birth and the decision to sell both Patience and the baby is probably the most psychologically complex part of this story. Mary Wilson, an enslaved housemaid, said that she found Miss Eveline seated in the nursery in the middle of the night, holding the child and singing lullabies, tears streaming down her face. On other occasions, Beaumont would get very angry if the child was brought into her presence, telling Patience to take it away right away and keep it quiet, as if the sight and sound of it were too much for her to handle. These dramatic mood swings show that she feels very conflicted about the child. She loves it as her own child, but is horrified by what its existence means for her breaking social and racial boundaries. During these months, household servants said that Beaumont's behavior was very strange. She would go from being very caring to the child to seeming disgusted or rejecting them. This psychological conflict seems to have gotten worse as the child grew, and as Dr. Harrington said, the child started to show signs that it was of mixed parentage. It seems that the choice to sell the child with Patience as its supposed mother was made in early September 1844. This timing matches up with Beaumont's visit to the law offices of Preston and Whitfield, which makes it likely that she was looking for legal advice about the sale. George Preston later said that he told Beaumont not to go through with the plan, but she did anyway. This shows how desperate she was to fix the situation that was becoming more and more impossible for her. The way the sale actually worked shows how the system of American slavery helped Beaumont try to cover up her crime. The ad in the Charleston Courier showed Patience and the baby as a package deal, which was common in slave sales and often kept families together, even though the system was meant to treat people like property. Historians have said that the high price James Woodward paid for a domestic servant and infant, $900, shows that he knew he was buying more than just labor. Some modern accounts of the transaction use the term fancy sale. which was a euphemism in the slave trade for the sale of enslaved women who were going to be used for sex by the people who bought them. It is still unclear whether Woodward was interested in Patience, the baby with the strange looks, or both. It's clear that the sale was meant to get Patience and the child out of Charleston, which would have gotten rid of any physical evidence of Beaumont's wrongdoing. Choosing a buyer from Colleton County, which is about 50 miles from Charleston, made it less likely that people in Beaumont's social circle would see the child as it got older and its features became clearer. The carefully planned plan started to fall apart when Marcus Reed tried to escape in October 1844. This attempt happened only a few weeks after the sale of Patience and the child, which makes it seem like Reed was worried about what would happen to his children. The large amount of money he had, $215, makes people wonder where it came from. Could Evelyn Beaumont have given Reed this money, maybe as payment or a way to get him to stay quiet? Or did Reed slowly save up this money in some other way, waiting for the right time to leave? The letter that Reed had in his possession and sent to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society is the clearest proof of how he felt about what had happened. The letter, according to court records, went into great detail about his relationship with Evelyn Beaumont, the birth of their child, and the lies that followed about who the child was. The most important thing the letter asked was for the society to try to find and buy the freedom of my son Thomas, sold along with the woman Patience, to James Woodward of Colleton County, South Carolina. This clear admission of paternity, along with the effort to get the child's freedom, suggests that Reed felt some level of fatherly duty toward the baby. This makes the story of Reed as just a calculating manipulator harder to understand, since he used his relationship with Beaumont to get what he wanted. He was willing to risk his chance of escape by carrying such incriminating papers, which shows how much he cared about the child's safety. The jailer's log shows that Evelyn Beaumont felt betrayed when Reed tried to escape. The jailer saw a heated exchange between Beaumont and Reed, and then Beaumont formally accused Reed. This makes it seem like Beaumont was scared and angry at Reed for doing something that could have revealed her most closely guarded secret. The charges of theft and attempted assault were clearly made up to make sure that Reed would get the worst punishment possible and that people wouldn't believe him if he tried to tell the truth about their relationship and the great child. In antebellum South Carolina, a white woman of standing accusing an enslaved man of a crime would have been taken at face value, which would have led to harsh punishment or death. George Preston, the lawyer who told Beaumont not to sell the child, broke the usual solidarity that white people show when it comes to slavery and racial boundaries. Preston's testimony that Beaumont had asked him about a child born to a white woman, but claimed to be born to an enslaved woman, went against what Beaumont had said and made Reed's story more believable. It is still not clear what made Preston come forward. He said in his testimony that he was acting out of professional ethics and Christian conscience, but some historians think that other things may have been going on as well. Records show that Preston's law firm had been in charge of the Beaumont family's business and property dealings for many years. It wouldn't have been easy to decide to publicly disagree with a longtime client and possibly ruin their reputation. Preston's testimony turned what could have been a normal case of an enslaved person trying to escape into a scandal that could have shown the hypocrisy and contradictions at the heart of Charleston's social order, no matter what his reasons were. The investigation ordered by Judge William Harper, who was also a member of the planter class and had a personal stake in keeping slavery going, shows how much Beaumont's actions were seen as a threat to the social order. The medical exam that showed the baby had a birthmark on its shoulder that matched one on Marcus Reed's shoulder gave Reed's claims of being the child's father physical proof. Reed's letter said that this physical marker, which had been passed down through Reed's mother's family, was a permanent sign of the child's ancestry that Beaumont's elaborate lies could not erase or hide. Dr. Harrington's sworn statement that he had delivered Evelyn Beaumont's child and had been paid to keep quiet about it brought down the story she had made up. The doctor's testimony, which came from a well-known member of the Charleston Professional Society, was very important and couldn't be dismissed as the lies of a desperate slave trying to avoid punishment. The legal and social consequences of these revelations were immediate and terrible. The Charleston Mercury called the case a scandal unparalleled in the recent history of our society, but this doesn't do justice to how shocked Charleston's upper classes were. The case brought up the biggest worries of white Southern society: the fear of racial mixing, the possibility that enslaved men could have some control over their lives, even though the system was meant to keep them from doing so, and the ability of white women, who were seen as the symbols of racial purity and social virtue, to break the rules they were supposed to follow. The way Charleston society split up over the scandal shows how much the case threatened established social narratives. People who completely stopped supporting Evelyn Beaumont were admitting how serious her crime against the racial order was. People who closed ranks around her and said that Marcus Reed had corrupted and forced her to do things were trying to keep up the lie that white women were weak and black men were predators, which was a big part of the ideology that justified slavery. The case's legal questions, especially about the status of the baby Thomas, were a big challenge to the system of property rights that defined American slavery. If the child was legally free because it was born to a free white woman, then selling it was not only fraud, but also a form of kidnapping or false imprisonment. But if the courts were to accept this legal fact, they would have to accept and make legal the result of a relationship that the whole social order was built to stop and condemn. Evelyn Beaumont's suicide on the 17th of January 1845 conveniently solved these legal problems. The main witness and person accused of the crimes died, which made it possible to quietly drop the case without having to deal with its more troubling effects on the legal and social system. The sealed letter to Reverend Palmer that was found next to Beaumont's body is one of the most interesting loose ends in this story. The choice to keep it sealed for 50 years suggests that the information inside was thought to be too sensitive or harmful to be made public right after the scandal. Most of the people who were directly involved in the case would have died by the time the seal was set to expire in 1895. The Civil War and the end of slavery would have changed the social and legal landscape. The fate of Marcus Reed, who was sold to a group of merchants and sent to Liberia, is another attempt to get rid of a problem from the story. The American Colonization Society's resettlement program, which moved formerly enslaved people to the colony of Liberia in West Africa, was often sold as a way to help people, but it was often used to get rid of free black people whose very presence challenged the racial hierarchies of American society. The fact that Patience and the baby Thomas disappeared into the huge system of American chattel slavery in Georgia shows how easy it was for people to disappear in this system, with their identities and histories erased as they were bought, sold, and moved across state lines. James Woodward's choice to sell them soon after buying them shows that he knew how complicated the law was about the child's status and wanted to stay out of the scandal. The finding of the hidden locket in 1895, which had pictures of Evelyn Beaumont and the baby inside and the words, "My heart divided against itself," gives us a moving look at the emotional truth behind the legal and social story. The way she talks about it makes it sound like Beaumont was having an internal conflict about her feelings for the child. She had to choose between her natural maternal attachment and the social pressures that told her to hide and deny that attachment. The fact that the locket was taken out of public view in 1932 at the request of Beaumont family descendants shows that the scandal's effects on reputations can last for decades after the events themselves. The desire to control the story about Beaumont's actions and keep people from seeing physical evidence of her wrongdoing shows how much the case still raised issues of family honor and social standing. The appearance of Thomas Wilson in 1893, who said he was the son of Marcus Reed and Evelyn Beaumont, adds another layer to this complicated story. Wilson's assertion of possessing Evelyn Beaumont's last letter, wherein she purportedly conveyed regret for treating her own kin as disposable property, indicates that she may have undergone a moral reckoning in her final moments. It is impossible to say for sure if Wilson was really the baby Thomas, who was somehow saved from slavery and raised in Pennsylvania. Historians have confirmed that the details he gave about the Beaumont residence could only have been known by someone who lived there. This gives his story some credibility. However, it is possible that this information could have been gathered through other means, such as talking to people who were involved in the case. What is still clear is that the case of Evelyn Beaumont and Marcus Reed is still a strong example of how the system of American slavery and the racist ideas that supported it hurt people. In this system, even the closest relationships, like those between lovers or between a mother and her child, were messed up by the harsh rules of property and racial hierarchy. The accounts of supernatural events at 17 Lagar Street, the crying woman, the figure at the window illustrate the conversion of historical trauma into folklore, a mechanism through which communities endeavor to comprehend and rationalize occurrences that disrupt their foundational perceptions of social order. Regardless of belief in these narratives, they illustrate the enduring influence of Eveline Beaumont's actions on Charleston's collective memory. The case of Eveline Beaumont and Marcus Reed is disturbing not only because it breaks social norms, but also because it shows how morally confused the society that made it is. A system that treated people like property made it possible for a mother to sell her own child instead of admitting that she had one. A society with strict racial hierarchies made it not only illegal, but also impossible to love or want someone from a different race. The real horror of this story isn't any supernatural element or graphic violence. It's how people can separate their hearts from each other in order to fit in with social norms and get ahead. It is a horror that still echoes in American society today as we deal with the long shadows that slavery and the ideas of racial difference that kept it going cast. The property at 17 Lagar Street changed owners several times in the years after the scandal. By the middle of the 20th century, it had become a museum of Charleston history. Its official literature did not mention the events that had taken place inside its walls in 1843 and 1844. In 1968, as part of a larger effort to be more honest about the city's complicated history, an exhibit was put up that talked about the Beaumont-Reed case. The house is now a silent witness to a part of American history that many would rather forget. This part shows how systems of oppression corrupt not only the people who are oppressed, but also the people who benefit from the oppression. The story of Eveline Beaumont and Marcus Reed reminds us that the worst things that happen aren't the ones that can be easily dismissed as superstition or fantasy. They're the ones that happen when people are shaped by unfair social systems. As the shadows grow longer on Lagar Street, you might picture Eveline Beaumont still standing at that upstairs window, looking out over the horizon for something she will never find. Her child, her moral compass, or maybe the person she could have been in a different society, one that didn't make her choose between her heart and her place in the world.